The neighborhood was one of those places where everything looked picture perfect on the surface, but beneath the manicured lawns and white picket fences, tensions brewed quietly. It was a cul-de-sac where most families kept to themselves, except for one woman who made it her mission to micromanage the entire street. Her name was Karen, and she lived 3 houses down from me. Karen was the type who took her self-appointed role as the unofficial HOA police far too seriously. She wasn't even on the board, yet she acted as though she owned the rights to the pavement, the sidewalks, and even the air we breathed. For months, I had tolerated her endless complaints about lawns being too wild, kids being too noisy, and garbage bins being left out for an extra 5 minutes. But her obsession didn't end there. My car became her new fixation. I drove a perfectly normal sedan, nothing flashy, nothing broken, and always well-maintained. I parked it either in my driveway or on the curb directly in front of my own property. It wasn't blocking mailboxes, driveways, or hydrants. It was completely legal, completely harmless. But to Karen, it was a public nuisance. At first, she tried to hint at it with passive-aggressive comments. She'd walk by, mutter something about street clutter, or loudly proclaim that cars parked on curbs ruin the aesthetic. I ignored her, thinking it was just another one of her petty grievances. But Karen wasn't the type to let go. She was the type who escalated. The first sign of trouble came when I found a handwritten note tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't polite, nor was it subtle. In big, bold letters, it read, "Move your car or else." The "or else" was underlined 3 times, as if she thought intimidation would somehow make me give up my right to park on my own street. I laughed it off at first. It seemed childish, even desperate. I tossed the note in the trash and went about my day. But Karen saw my silence as defiance. To her, I wasn't just parking my car. I was challenging her imagined authority. Within a week, the situation escalated. I came home one afternoon to find chalk lines drawn around my car, as if someone had been marking it for removal. The chalk extended onto the street, making crude arrows that pointed directly at my driveway. It was as if she was sending a message. Your car belongs here and nowhere else. The neighborhood gossip mill churned quickly. Other neighbors whispered that Karen had been bragging about getting rid of eyesores and teaching people respect. Some rolled their eyes at her antics, but no one dared confront her directly. She had a reputation for turning even the smallest disagreements into full-blown wars. I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something drastic. And sure enough, that moment came one quiet Saturday morning. I woke up to the faint rumble of a diesel engine outside my window. Peering through the blinds, I saw a tow truck idling in front of my house. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the license plate of my car. At first, I thought there must be some mistake. My registration was up to date. I had no tickets, no outstanding violations. But then I saw her, Karen, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. She was pointing at my car, nodding at the driver as if she were the one giving orders. It all made sense in that moment. Karen had actually called a tow company on my vehicle, convinced she had the power to dictate where I could and couldn't park. She must have spun some elaborate story, claiming my car was abandoned or illegally parked. The brazenness of it all was almost unbelievable. But as the driver approached my car, clipboard ready, I stepped outside. The moron. Ning air was crisp, but the tension was suffocating. Karen's grin faltered slightly when she saw me, but she quickly recovered. Barking something at the driver I couldn't quite hear. She must have been insisting that she was in the right, that she had authority. The driver looked uncertain, flipping through his papers. Something about the situation clearly didn't sit right with him. He was used to towing cars from apartment complexes or city streets, not quiet suburban neighborhoods where a neighbor was acting like a self-appointed sheriff. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My mere presence forced the driver to double-check his orders. He glanced at Karen, then back at me, and finally shook his head. The tow wasn't legitimate. There was no record, no authorization, nothing that justified removing my car. Without the green light, he wasn't willing to risk his job over some neighborly spat. Karen's face turned red. She sputtered, gesturing wildly, insisting the driver was making a mistake. But the damage was done. The tow truck driver packed up his clipboard, climbed back into his cab, and drove away, leaving Karen fuming on the curb. I thought that might be the end of it, that perhaps she would finally realize she had overstepped. But Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. If anything, the failed tow attempt only fueled her obsession further. She had tried and failed, and now she was determined to win at all costs. As I watched her storm back toward her house, muttering under her breath, I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. The chalk, the notes, the tow truck, those were just the opening moves in a battle that was about to spiral far beyond petty neighborhood disputes. The war over my car had only just begun. After the failed tow truck incident, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would finally get the message. Most people would feel embarrassed after being caught red-handed trying to misuse authority they didn't have. But Karen wasn't most people. She was the type who took embarrassment as a challenge, who saw humiliation not as a defeat, but as fuel for her next move. The very next day, I noticed her pacing up and down the street with a notepad in her hand. She was scribbling furiously, stopping at each house, jotting things down, shaking her head as though she were compiling some secret report. My car seemed to catch her eye every time she passed, and she made a show of glaring at it as if its very existence offended her. Later, I learned she had been going door to door, telling neighbors that my vehicle was a safety hazard and a criminal magnet. According to her, cars parked on the street attracted suspicious characters, though no one had ever seen any such thing in our quiet cul-de-sac. She spun tales of burglaries in nearby neighborhoods, implying that my car was somehow an invitation to crime. Her words carried weight with a handful of people who either feared her wrath or simply didn't want to get involved. But most neighbors rolled their eyes behind her back. Still, Karen wasn't discouraged. If she couldn't turn the community against me, she would escalate in other ways. Within a week, I began to notice strange occurrences. First, I found a bright orange sticker slapped on my windshield that read, "Illegally parked, subject to tow." At first, I thought it was official, but closer inspection revealed it was a homemade printout, complete with uneven fonts and a misspelled word. It was the kind of forgery only someone desperate enough would think looked legitimate. A few days later, I returned home to find small scratches along the side of my car. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate. Someone had taken a key or sharp object to the paint. My stomach twisted with frustration, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen had crossed from annoyance into outright vandalism, though I had no proof yet. Still, I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me panic. Instead, I documented everything. I photographed the scratches, the fake sticker, the chalk lines that still faintly lingered on the pavement. Quietly, I installed a small security camera on my porch, angled just right to capture the front of my house and the street. If Karen wanted to play games, I would let her dig her own grave. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior grew more unhinged. Every morning, she would position herself in front of her house, sipping coffee as if she were a guard on patrol. Anytime I left for work, she'd make a point of writing something in her notepad. Anytime I came home, she'd shake her head dramatically, loud enough for anyone nearby to notice. She was trying to make a spectacle out of my perfectly ordinary parking habits. The breaking point came one Thursday evening when I heard the rumble of another tow truck outside. My stomach dropped. Surely she wouldn't try again after the last fiasco. But when I stepped outside, there it was. Another truck, this time already lowering its hook toward my bumper. Karen stood proudly beside it, hands on her hips, beaming with triumph. This time she must have pulled some strings, convinced the towing company that my car was abandoned or illegally parked. The driver, unlike the first one, didn't look hesitant. He was already securing his equipment when I approached. But what Karen hadn't realized was that my new security camera had caught her the night before, sneaking across the street, peeling the fake illegally parked sticker off another printout, and placing it on my windshield under the cover of darkness. That video clip, paired with her obvious involvement now, was damning evidence. Before I could even intervene, another car pulled up. It was one of our neighbors, Mr. Daniels, who lived across the street. He had been watching Karen's antics for weeks and finally decided enough was enough. He stormed over, pointing at my car and demanding to know why a perfectly legal vehicle was being towed. The driver paused, caught off guard, suddenly unsure whether he was being manipulated again. Karen, flustered, tried to wave him off. She insisted she had authority and that the neighborhood had rules against street parking. But Daniels wasn't buying it. He knew the bylaws, and there was no such rule. Her bluff was unraveling in real time. The tow truck driver hesitated, clearly realizing he'd been fed a false report. After a tense standoff, he unhooked my car and left without saying much, muttering under his breath as he drove away. Karen was left standing in the street, her face twisted in rage, her plan once again foiled. This time, however, I had more than just suspicion. I had evidence. The scratches on my car, the fake stickers, the surveillance footage, and now a second attempted tow. All of it painted a clear picture of harassment and malicious intent. But I didn't confront her then. No. I let her stew in her anger, let her storm back into her house muttering threats about calling the authorities. I knew that her downfall was coming, and all I had to do was be patient. What Karen didn't realize was that in her obsession to get rid of my car, she had set herself up for the ultimate backfire. The very system she tried to manipulate would soon turn against her in the most satisfying way, and the first domino was about to fall. Karen's rage after the second failed tow attempt was impossible to miss. She slammed her front door so hard that the windows rattled, and for days afterward she refused to make eye contact with anyone in the neighborhood. But her silence wasn't peace. It was preparation. I could feel it in the air, the way she lingered in her yard longer than usual, the way she paced up and down her driveway as if plotting her next move. When people like Karen feel cornered, they don't back down. They lash out, and the more desperate they are, the more reckless their actions become. It started with the calls. Several. Neighbors mentioned that Karen had been dialing the non-emergency police line, reporting suspicious activity outside my house. Each time the officers arrived to find nothing unusual, just me, my car, and a quiet street. The reports went nowhere, but Karen wasn't deterred. If anything, she seemed energized by the attention. Then came the letters. I found envelopes in my mailbox with no return address, each containing typed threats telling me to move my junk car or face serious consequences. They were anonymous in theory, but the wording, the phrasing, even the dramatic tone, it all screamed Karen. She believed anonymity made her untouchable, but every act was just another piece of the puzzle I was quietly assembling. The tension escalated further one night when I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. My security camera caught her creeping around my car, flashlight in hand, peering into the windows as if she were searching for something incriminating. She circled it twice, then crouched near the tires before scurrying back across the street. The next morning, I discovered the damage. 2 of my tires were slashed, deflated overnight. It wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated. Personal. Karen had crossed a line from harassment into outright destruction of property. By now, my security footage had grown into a collection of incriminating moments. Karen placing fake stickers, scratching the paint, loitering near my car at odd hours, and now tampering with the tires. Each clip was time-stamped, clear, and undeniable. I shared the evidence with a trusted neighbor, Daniels, who shook his head in disbelief. He'd known Karen was difficult, but he hadn't realized how far she was willing to go. Still, I didn't rush to involve law enforcement just yet. I knew Karen's arrogance would push her even further, and when she overplayed her hand, the fallout would be spectacular. And sure enough, her desperation soon reached its peak. One Friday afternoon, I returned home to find yet another tow truck parked in front of my house. But this time, something was different. Instead of the driver heading for my car, he was parked awkwardly in the middle of the street, hazard lights flashing, and a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk. Curious, I approached, and what I saw nearly made me laugh out loud. Karen's own SUV was hooked up to the tow rig, its front wheels already lifted off the ground. She was pacing frantically beside it, waving her arms, shouting at the driver to put it down immediately. Apparently, in her frenzy to get my car removed, she had made a critical mistake. In her latest round of phone calls to the tow company, she had provided the wrong address, or perhaps the dispatcher had finally grown tired of her bogus complaints and decided to investigate properly. Either way, when the truck arrived, the only vehicle that matched the abandoned description she gave was her own, a slightly older SUV that often sat untouched in her driveway for weeks at a time. The irony was delicious. The same woman who had tried again and again to tow away my perfectly legal car was now watching helplessly as her own vehicle was being hauled off. The neighbors, usually too polite to involve themselves, couldn't help but whisper and chuckle at the spectacle. Phones came out, photos were snapped, and videos were recorded. Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red with every click of a camera. She tried to argue with the driver, insisting it was a mistake, but the paperwork was clear. Her car was being impounded for improper registration and expired tags, something the authorities had apparently noticed during the investigation. I stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, resisting the urge to gloat. Karma had a way of delivering justice without any need for interference, and this was proof of it. Karen's obsession with me had blinded her to her own negligence, and now she was paying the price in front of the very neighbors she had tried to rally against me. The tow truck pulled away, Karen screaming and chasing after it until it disappeared around the corner. When she turned back, the laughter and whispers of the neighbors were too much for her to bear. She stormed inside, slamming her door yet again, but the damage to her reputation was irreparable. For the first time, the balance of power on the street shifted. People who once tolerated her antics now saw her for what she truly was, a hypocrite, a bully, and the author of her own downfall. But Karen wasn't finished. Humiliation only hardened her resolve. She would come back with a vengeance, determined to reclaim the control she had lost. What she didn't realize, however, was that every step she took only tightened the noose around her own neck, and soon she would push too far for the law to ignore. Karen's SUV being hauled away should have been the end of it. For most people, the embarrassment of losing their own car to the very system they weaponized would have been enough to trigger some long overdue self-reflection. But Karen wasn't most people. For her, humiliation was gasoline on a fire, and instead of backing down, she set out to scorch the entire neighborhood. The morning after her SUV disappeared, she was already back outside, fuming, marching up and down the street like a soldier on patrol. She clutched her phone in one hand, snapping photos of every car parked along the curb, muttering loudly about illegal vehicles and community violations. It was as if she was building her own case against the entire neighborhood, desperate to shift the spotlight away from herself. Her wrath, however, was still centered squarely on me. Every time she passed my house, her eyes narrowed, and her jaw clenched. She began to file complaint after complaint with the HOA, even though, ironically, she wasn't even an official member of the board. Word spread quickly that the HOA president had grown tired of her daily calls and endless emails, so much so that they'd started ignoring her altogether. That only seemed to fuel her paranoia. Soon her tactics grew bolder. One evening, I returned home to find a neon green notice of violation taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was official, until I noticed the glaring typos and the fact that it wasn't on HOA letterhead. Karen had forged the notice herself, demanding that I remove my vehicle immediately or face fines up to $5,000. It was laughable, really. So absurd it would have been comical if not for how relentless she had become. But while her fake notices and petty intimidation tactics didn't scare me, they were enough to make some neighbors nervous. Mrs. Green, who lived next door, confided that she was beginning to worry about Karen targeting her family next. The fear in her voice told me just how much Karen's reign of intimidation had poisoned the street. I reassured her quietly, though I didn't reveal the full extent of what I'd been doing. By now, my collection of evidence against Karen was massive. Dozens of video clips from the security camera, photos of vandalism, the forged stickers and fake notices, even recordings of her shouting obscenities at my car when she thought no one was watching. Every act she committed added another nail to the coffin she was building for herself. Still, I waited. Timing was everything. Karen was reckless, but I knew her obsession hadn't yet reached its peak. She was still too careful, too willing to hide behind fake authority. I needed her to step so far out of line that even the law couldn't ignore her. That moment arrived one night in the most dramatic fashion possible. It was nearly midnight when the sound of scraping metal jolted me awake. I rushed to the window and froze at what I saw. Karen, dressed in dark clothing, was in my the driveway with a crowbar in hand. She wasn't just hovering near my car this time, she was actively trying to pry open the driver's side door. Her SUV had been gone for days, and apparently, her desperation to reassert dominance had driven her to outright burglary. The security camera caught everything in perfect clarity. The crowbar, the damage to my door, the wild look in her eyes as she muttered angrily to herself. It was the final piece of evidence I needed, the moment her harassment tipped fully into criminal territory. I didn't confront her. I didn't even turn on the lights. Instead, I quietly called the police, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation. By the time the squad car pulled into the cul-de-sac, Karen was still at it, too consumed by rage to notice the flashing lights until it was too late. The scene that unfolded was something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. Officers stepped out, shining their flashlights directly on her as she froze mid-swing, crowbar in hand. She tried to stammer an excuse, something about protecting the neighborhood and illegal parking, but her words rang hollow. Within minutes, the handcuffs were on, and Karen was being escorted into the back of the police car while the entire street watched from their windows. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't the aggressor, the self-appointed sheriff of the block. She was just a criminal, caught red-handed in front of the very people she had tormented for months. The officers took statements, collected the security footage, and assured me that the case against her was strong. With vandalism, forgery, harassment, and now attempted vehicle break-in on record, Karen was facing real legal consequences, far beyond HOA disputes or neighborhood squabbles. As the police car pulled away, the street was eerily quiet. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, staring, exchanging glances that were equal parts relief and disbelief. The queen of drama, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, had finally fallen. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly, even after an arrest. There would be fallout, court hearings, whispers in the neighborhood. The story was far from over. What none of us realized, however, was that her downfall had only just begun, and the biggest blow to her ego and her life was still on its way. Karen's arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For years, she had thrived on intimidation, weaponizing fear and gossip to maintain her grip on the cul-de-sac. But with flashing police lights illuminating her downfall, that power evaporated overnight. The morning after, The street buzzed with quiet chatter. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her began speaking more freely, sharing their own encounters and frustrations. Mrs. Green admitted that Karen had slipped threatening notes into her mailbox months earlier. Mr. Lopez revealed that she had called city inspectors on his home renovation project, costing him weeks of delays. Daniels, the man who once confronted her during the tow truck debacle, said she had even threatened to sue him for harassment when he dared to question her claims. Piece by piece, a picture of Karen's long history of manipulation came into focus. She hadn't just targeted me. She had tormented the entire neighborhood for years, hiding behind the pretense of protecting property values. Now that she was exposed, no one felt the need to protect her reputation. Meanwhile, the legal process began to unfold. Karen faced charges of vandalism, harassment, forgery, and attempted vehicle burglary. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, photographs, witness statements, and even the crowbar recovered from the scene. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a misunderstood resident with good intentions, but the narrative didn't stick. Too many people had seen her true colors. At the preliminary hearing, she sat in the courtroom visibly shaken, her trademark smugness replaced by a look of simmering panic. The judge listened carefully as the evidence was presented, his expression hardening with each piece of proof. When the footage of her slashing my tires and attempting to break into my car played on the screen, there was no room left for doubt. Karen had crossed from petty nuisance into criminal behavior. While the legal proceedings played out, the neighborhood itself transformed. Without Karen's constant interference, people began to relax. Children played freely in the street, without her marching over to scold them for being too loud. Neighbors lingered outside, chatting without fear of being reported for loitering. The air felt lighter, as though the whole community had been holding its breath and was finally free to exhale. Yet Karen herself couldn't accept her fall from grace. Out on bail, she returned to her house, but she was no longer the self-appointed enforcer of the block. Now, she was a pariah. Her SUV, retrieved from impound, sat untouched in the driveway, a constant reminder of her hypocrisy. Curtains in her windows remained drawn, but occasionally, neighbors spotted her peeking out, glaring at anyone who passed. She tried, briefly, to regain control. A week after her hearing, she slipped poorly printed flyers under everyone's doors, claiming she was the victim of a neighborhood conspiracy, led by me. She insisted the charges were fabricated, the videos edited, the witnesses biased. But instead of rallying support, the flyers became fuel for more laughter. People pinned them to bulletin boards as jokes, shaking their heads at her inability to face reality. The HOA, which had previously tolerated her meddling, finally took official action. They issued her a formal cease and desist letter, warning her that any her harassment would result in fines and legal action from the association itself. For someone who had long pretended to speak on the HOA's behalf, it was the ultimate humiliation, a written declaration that she had no authority at all. Despite the mounting consequences, Karen clung to denial. She stormed into HOA meetings, ranting about illegal parking and community standards, only to be shut down each time. Neighbors began recording her tirades, uploading them to social media where they spread quickly. Clips of her shouting incoherently at board members went viral, drawing ridicule from strangers who had never even set foot in our neighborhood. The irony was almost poetic. For years, Karen had tried to control her little corner of the world, convinced she held power. Now the very image she had crafted was being shredded, not just locally but online, where thousands mocked her self-destructive behavior. And yet, the biggest blow was still to come. As the court date approached, her lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal. But Karen, still blinded by her need to win, rejected it outright. She insisted on a trial, convinced she could prove her innocence. It was a gamble, and one she would soon regret. Because what Karen didn't realize was that the courtroom wasn't the only place she was losing. The court of public opinion had already judged her, and in that court, she had no chance of redemption. By the time the trial began, she was utterly alone. No neighbors came to support her. No one in the HOA spoke on her behalf. Even her family, who occasionally visited before, seemed to vanish from sight. She had alienated everyone with her arrogance, and now she would face the consequences without allies. The trial itself was a spectacle, but its outcome was never in doubt. Each piece of evidence stacked higher against her. Each witness chipped away at her defense, and, when the jury finally delivered its verdict, Karen's face crumpled in disbelief. Guilty. Not just of one charge, but multiple counts. Enough to ensure fines, community service, and a criminal record that would haunt her for years. As the gavel struck, the neighborhood's long nightmare had officially ended. But for Karen, the real punishment was just beginning. The verdict marked the end of Karen's reign, but in many ways, it was only the beginning of her reckoning. For someone who had lived her entire life convinced she was untouchable, the reality of legal consequences was crushing. Her sentence wasn't jail time, though some whispered she had narrowly avoided it, but it was harsh enough to shatter her pride. She was ordered to pay hefty fines, complete hundreds of hours of community service, and attend mandatory anger management classes. More humiliating still, she was placed under a restraining order, legally forbidden from contacting me or harassing any of the neighbors she had once tormented. The ruling stripped away the last remnants of her self-assigned authority. Karen could no longer pretend to be the neighborhood enforcer when the law itself had branded her as the problem. But the punishment didn't stop in the courtroom. Word of the trial spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. Clips of her HOA tirades, her failed attempts at intimidation, and even her arrest circulated online, where they became fodder for viral memes. She became infamous, not as a protector of property values, but as the cautionary tale of a neighborhood Karen who took things too far. Every trip outside her home was now accompanied by whispers, stares, and sometimes laughter. Delivery drivers smirked as they dropped packages at her door. Strangers slowed their cars just to snap photos of the house where that Karen lived. For someone who once thrived on appearances and control, the public shame was unbearable. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to heal. Without Karen's constant interference, small acts of freedom blossomed everywhere. Kids rode bikes down the street without fear of being scolded. Families hosted barbecues that stretched late into the evening, music drifting through the air without complaint. Lawns grew a little less perfect. Decorations became a little more colorful, and for the first time in years, people felt comfortable being themselves. My own car, once the target of her endless obsession, remained parked proudly in its usual spot. Each morning when I walked outside, it felt like a small victory, a quiet reminder that standing your ground against tyranny, no matter how petty, was worth it. Karen, however, continued to spiral. With her reputation in tatters, her influence gone, and her finances strained by fines and legal fees, she became increasingly reclusive. Curtains stayed drawn. Her yard, once obsessively manicured, began to wither from neglect. The woman who once policed everyone else's property now couldn't keep her own in order. Eventually, the for sale sign appeared on her lawn. It was inevitable. She couldn't bear the humiliation of staying in a neighborhood where no one respected her, where every glance felt like judgment, where every street corner reminded her of her failure. The house lingered on the market for months, the stigma of its owner making potential buyers uneasy. When she finally moved out, there was no farewell, no parting words, no grand confrontation. One morning, the moving truck arrived, and by evening the house was empty. Just like that, Karen was gone. The neighborhood didn't celebrate loudly, but the relief was palpable. People exchanged quiet smiles, knowing the chapter had closed. The air felt lighter, freer, as though the shadow that had loomed for so long had finally lifted. And as for me, I learned a valuable truth through it all. Karen's downfall wasn't about revenge, or even about my car. It was about patience, and she had destroyed herself with her own obsession, her own arrogance. All I had to do was stand firm, document,